Hey everybody, welcome back to class. Today we're going to be continuing our series on interpersonal relationships, really diving and exploring the theory of relational dialectics. So a lot of what we're going to be covering today is going to involve content from chapter 11. A little preview about what we have planned for today in regards to relational dialectics is breaking down the theory, understanding its component parts, and providing some practical situations about where relational dialectics might apply within our interpersonal relationships. We're also going to engage in some in-class activities labeled as Task 1 and Task 2. Keep in mind these are on Canvas for you to fill out and submit. You can locate those under Canvas assignments, clearly labeled as Task 1 and Task 2 under our Relational Dialectics module. And then we're going to preview some expectations for next class so we can know what we're going into for our next lecture. That being said, let's go ahead and get started. So I want you to take a second and think about a time in a relationship, whether that's personal, professional, or romantic, where you felt like you had to choose between two opposing and contradictory options, choices, or feelings. Some of these questions might resolve around, what did that relationship look like? How did you feel within those interactions? And how did you adjust the way that you communicated with someone else? So again, no need to memorize these types of questions, but a series of questions I want us to think about as we're diving into relational dialectics and understanding it as a communication theory. So some situations where relational dialectics might apply, maybe you felt the tension between your work and life balance. How much effort and how much relationships and how much time do you put within your work life to be satisfied? But at the same time, how much time do you put within your interpersonal relationships? What does that confliction look like? How do you communicate around that? And more importantly, how do you communicate those needs when you're experiencing that tension? Another tension and common tension you might feel are new experiences versus settling down. Maybe you want to experience travel, visit new places, countries, experiences, and have that independence and have the ability to do so. But also you maybe feel at the same time that you want to settle down, you want to start a family, you want to have a house, and you want to be settled within a community that you really enjoy. Nothing is wrong with either two, but sometimes we do feel those tensions and those issues within our relationships, within our experiences, and within those feelings that we have. And then also maybe you might have conflictions between your alone time and being social. When is it appropriate to be independent? When do you need to take time for yourself to be mindful within these specific situations? And then when do you need to be social? When do you need to have relationships? When do you need to develop and go out and be extroverted? And at the same time, we could really feel that we need our alone time and desire it, while also wanting the attention of others and the ability to develop those relationships. All of this stuff leads to our conversation on relational dialectics theory. So some common phrases that you might have heard in day-to-day conversations are opposites attract. You might have also heard the same phrase, birds of a feather flock together. These are two contradictory ideals or ideas about what is sort of best or what is the best choice in terms of how we communicate and we interact. The same tension between two is a company and three is a crowd versus more the merrier. How many people are you trying to interact, and the different cultural ways of being and saying these things ultimately conflict based on two different ideals. So much like the tug of war image that you see within the background here, we're often conflicted between two different ideals or two different ways of communicating and being. This is exactly what we're looking at in terms of relational dialectics theory. So proposed by Baxter and Rollins in 1988, relational life is characterized by these ongoing tensions between contradictory impulses. We have contradictory needs and desires that we really want to satisfy in life, and communicating around that can be difficult. Humans also experience these collisions between opposing desires and needs, specifically within relational communication itself. And then when making these decisions, it's important that we give voice to multiple viewpoints and desires that often contradict each other. But it often feels like, and many people say it's impossible to actually multitask. That is the big challenge with relational dialectics theory. How do you communicate two contradictory ideas and feelings at once, even though that we feel things at the same exact time, while also recognizing the multiple needs and desires of others within an interpersonal relationship? Relational dialectics theory is really based off of Mikhail Bakhtin's perspective on dialogue. So I want to draw your attention to the quote over here to the right. Truth is not born, nor is it to be found inside of an individual person. It's born between collectively searching for truth in the process of their dialogic interaction. Really what Bakhtin is getting at here is that social life is an open dialogue among many different voices. We're not talking in isolation, we're not making exchanges with just one person, but all of the meanings that we have in life are communicated in a lot of different ways. This is represented by a theory termed heteroglossia, which is the coexistence of different varieties of voices in a conversation or discourse. In terms of interpersonal relationships, this really appeals to the different kinds of values that we set, whether that be people's different definitions of independence, different definitions of connection, different definitions of what the ideal relationship is supposed to be. We all have different opinions and meanings, and in conversation together, that meaning is dynamic and dependent on people's perceptions and relationships. More importantly, what Bakhtin points out is that relationships are possible by maintaining at least two distinct voices. This can be more than one voice within a relationship, but when we consider interpersonal relationships between two people, these relationships are possible by maintaining those distinct voices and valuing those voices in particular. When we look at a relational dialectics theory, that is really the goal. How do you recognize people's relationships while also balancing and advocating for your own needs and desires? Additionally, this theory is based on a dialectical perspective, meaning that there are multiple points of view at play that play off of each other within contradiction. So if we're looking at Friedrich Hegel's dialectic, where you have a thesis, antithesis, and a synthesis, basically one argument coming into context with another argument and forming a whole new different type of meaning based on those interpersonal interactions. Now, you might have seen this theory within your English classes or within writing specific papers. We want to view this in terms of values, expectations, needs, and desires within an interpersonal relationship. How do we synthesize these different needs within communication? So multiple points of view are at play, and 2 points initiate meaning, and their communication results in a whole new different meaning. So within that relationship, how do you create and negotiate and create new forms of meaning with your communication? What this is really looking at specifically within relational dialectics is that we're looking at meanings existing as both and. Two meanings can exist at the same time. We could have autonomy and independence existing with our needs for connectedness and desires to connect with one another at the same time. Rather than this either or black and white perspective, this is really what we're getting at in terms of a dialectical perspective. And we often have these contradictory needs, and these responses within these relationships are not always balanced and clear cut. While we can have two meanings both and, that doesn't mean that they are equally distributed or they're equally negotiated. And that's really going to depend and affect the context and the situation of the relationship. So we can see distinction of dialectical perspective in contrast to monologic or dualistic perspectives. A monologic being one linear meaning is not necessarily changing, and you're communicating from point A to point B. You can also view things in the dualistic perspective. This is our either or perspective, where you're either this or that. You're either independent or you're connected, and you're only able to choose between two different things. What a dialectic perspective brings to the fold is more representations about what we experience in reality, the kind of contradictions we have in relationships and how we communicate around them, and how different meanings can form by looking at different points. So as you can see on the dialectic graphic here, visually it's a little bit more complicated, and also communicatively it's a lot more complicated, which makes relationships in general more complicated. Some general assumptions of the theory: that relationships are not necessarily linear, and relational life is characterized by constant forms of change. So even though we are engaged in dialectics, changing what dialectics we're going to communicate around, how they're really established in our relationships, and what dialectics we lean towards are going to determine what we're expecting here, or how that relational life is developed. Relational life is always changing and developing within these specific ways. Contradiction is a fundamental fact of relational life, so we always deal with contradictions, and the way that we communicate them, there's some strategic options and practical ways that we can develop our relationships through that. And then communication is central to organizing and negotiating these relational contradictions. We need communication to do so. And if we fail to communicate effectively and not know how to do it within the specific relational contexts, then our communication and our relationships ultimately fall apart. So this is why understanding the general assumptions of relational dialectics theory is important for our lesson. Some basic relational dialectics, there are several that have been theorized and developed, but what we're going to focus on and apply later in our activity today are these three basic dialectical tensions. So autonomy or connection, so how independent do you feel versus how deeply you want to connect. We can look at this in a variety of different relationships. How much me time do you need in a relationship versus how many situations where you want to communicate and interact together with possibly your romantic partner or a friend specifically. How do you want to be independent within different friend groups where you're not necessarily interacting with this person you're in a relationship versus how do you want to merge and connect different kinds of friend groups? What does that situation look like, and how do you communicate between independence or autonomy and connection? We also communicate a sense of openness or protection. So how open are we in communication relationships? Some people you might have met along down the line will self-disclose everything. And that sometimes makes some people feel uncomfortable. For others, it doesn't. And people really appreciate that kind of openness that can depend on the relationship, the cultures, and identities that we really interact with. Or you could view things on the other side. Maybe you're a little bit more protective or secure about your identity. And more importantly, this can change based on the context that we're looking at. Maybe you are more open with your friend groups day to day, and maybe you're a little bit more protected and reserved in the classroom because you don't have the same kind of relationships, or you haven't developed the same kind of repertoire with the people in that space. We can also communicate novelty or predictability. So in other words, the familiarity or unfamiliarity you want to expect in life. Oftentimes in relationships, we want them to be novel, unique, and really value them for their uniqueness and their specialness. But at the same time, we'd love for them to be predictable. We'd love to have some consistency, some perspectives to show that element of caring within a relationship. So does that mean your relationship needs more spontaneous trips to Hawaii, or spontaneous gestures like flowers randomly for your partner during the week? Or do you need more predictability in terms of day-to-day expectations within a shared living space, expectations of when you're supposed to share time? What do those situations of familiarity and unfamiliarity look like within these specific contexts? We also have contextual dialectics, so the public versus private dialectic, meaning what do our communication situations and how do we communicate dialectics in our relations between our public and private life? So how do you behave, for an example, at work as you behave within your private relationships? How do you behave maybe in an interpersonal public setting at a party versus your interpersonal experiences within private, intimate spaces? You might communicate and self-disclose different things depending on your comfortability and depending on your feelings of desires within those spaces. The key thing here is context and where we're having these conversations as well. We can also have a contextual dialectic based on the real and ideal understandings from a relationship. So the real being the everyday experiences that you might have with a friendship or partner. What do the everyday conversations really look like? What do the everyday conflicts and tensions that you negotiate and go through? What are the everyday struggles that really foster and make relationships strong? But at the same time, what do you strive for within those relationships? What is the ideal? What is the expectation or the obligation that you have towards relational partners within a specific context? What is that ideal interpersonal relationship that we also strive for? So both of these are on dialectic, having our public and private needs also in tension with our real and ideal needs in terms of our relationships. All of this being based in context. So for our first task, looking at these different relational dialectics and explaining them, what I would like us to do for task 1 in Canvas is watch and analyze the following video of the Code Switch song from Big Mouth. So a really popular song, but really kind of gets at this idea of relational dialectics and how we might understand. I have clicked and had the link posted up here for your reference if you'd like to download the PowerPoint from files. It's also uploaded within our Canvas assignment. What I would like you to answer within the prompt is, thinking about code switching, answer the following questions in What basic dialectic, autonomy or connection, openness, protection, novelty, or prediction do you think best represents code switching and why? Then I would like you to answer what contextual dialectic, public or private, or real or ideal, does this case study best apply to and why? So again, making sure you're really answering that why question, giving some details rather than just labeling, provide some rationale within your answer specifically and give that robust answer in particular. After you analyze that code switch song, moving beyond simply analyzing these particular relationships, we also want to dive into how we might respond to different dialectics. So what are the practical goals that we're looking for in particular? How can we communicate mutually and effectively within relationships that we are in? How can we listen to the multiple needs of someone else? And how can we communicate to clearly assert our own needs while learning when to let go of certain needs for the sake of the relationship? So what are the practical ways rather than just simply identifying dialectics themselves? So relational dialectics theory has a few tension management strategies: cyclical alteration, segmentation, selection, integration, and then under integration, three subcategories of neutralizing, disqualifying, and reframing. So cyclical alteration is choosing different poles at different times. So we look at the dialectical tension, autonomy, and connection. You're looking about how you move across the poles as the relationships develop over time. Maybe you had extreme autonomy when you started a relationship, but then you leaned more towards strategies of connection or forms of communication where you really wanted to connect as you develop that relationship over time. But this can also digress. Maybe you were really connecting and self-disclosing a lot of things early on within the relationship, but then you became more reserved as you realized how that relationship unfolded and what those dynamics really looked like. Segmentation, we can also use a particular response, so choosing different poles for different contexts. A very basic example would be that public and private distinction and communication strategy. Maybe I use different forms of communication in public settings versus those private settings. Maybe I add more self-disclosure within those private settings, and I am a little bit more superficial or a little bit more surface level with the communication that I'm doing within those public settings. So segmenting your communication based on the context that you're in. Selection would be choosing one pole and acting like the other does not exist. So for an example, if you are interacting with people that are extremely open, you might really ignore your perspectives of being closed or being protective with your communication. You might be open to when the situation calls, depending on the relationship. However, you might also establish your own self-independence or autonomy. Maybe people are really open, but you choose to be reserved within those relationships or within those contexts to express your needs more specifically. Again, it all depends on the relational situation and what people we're interacting with and talking to. Integration is very much the ideal, synthesizing poles with intention. So this can involve neutralizing, where you have an ideal compromise, where you recognize both parts of a communication strategy. So maybe you negotiate that, yes, I can be independent or autonomous in this way, but I might communicate or expect some form of connectedness from myself as well, because my partner is expecting me to connect within these specific ways. You're negotiating an appeal and recognizing someone else's needs while allowing for someone to accept your desires and needs, and letting go with some of the clear-cut needs that you have to really neutralize and make that compromise. Disqualifying, so exempting certain issues from a general problem. So for an example, in a relationship, you might exclude certain topics within the conversation. So we're not going to talk about sex, race, we're not going to talk about gender or politics within this situation. I often think of this at the family setting. You know, today we are not going to talk about politics at the Thanksgiving table. That doesn't always work out within those situations, but this is an example of communicating a strategy of disqualifying. To maintain the relationship, we can't have a conversation in this space based on prior history, based on different situations involved with that. More importantly, we can also reframe, so transforming oppositions so they no longer appear to oppose on one another. So for an example, you might communicate, well, in order to be truly independent in our relationship, we need to communicate and connect in different ways. I need to hear some communication from you that is trying to connect with me in order to be able to, for me to trust you within specific ways of being independent and having your own relationships and developing those distinctions. So reframing to make it look like there's no poles that exist at all, and blending the two specifically. So again, a lot of ways that we can develop those tension management strategies. So for task 2, I'd like us to consider the following situation. And again, just following up on the assignment on Canvas. Eric and Danielle met in their public speaking class at Colorado Mountain College and are becoming great friends. Danielle is new to the college. She really wants to make new friends like Eric, but also feels the pressure to do well in her classes since she is on a scholarship that requires her to maintain a 3.0 GPA. Eric asked Danielle if she wants to come to a party on Saturday night to meet some of his friends, just the situation Danielle wants. Danielle knows making friends and being social will help her long-term in college. However, Danielle also has a history exam on Monday that she has not studied for at all. Danielle has a decent grades, but failing the exam would drop her below that 3.0. Applying relational dialectics theory, what I would like us to do is analyze how Danielle might resolve this tension in particular. And what I'd like us to do is put us within Danielle's shoes. So for the task 2 assignment on Canvas, there's going to be 3 prompts that I'd like you to answer. The first being, what dialectical tension do you think is going on within the situation? Second, which tension management strategy would you use to resolve this situation in particular? And then finally, I'd like you to write or submit a recording or writing your response based on the situation and the tension management that you choose. So what would your communication practically and specifically look like as you recognize and understand these theories as well? All right, folks, that wraps it up for our lecture on relational dialectics. Next class, we're going to go over our responses for task 1 and task 2. And then next class, we're going to continue our lecture on chapter 12, expectancy violations theory. Like I said, if you have any questions, please email me or reach out during my office hours. I'll be happy to answer those questions. All righty, folks, have a great day, and I'll see you next class. Bye now.